Is the threat to free speech on campus overstated? I'm Sonia Debrazzini, and this is Scholars Mate. Hello and welcome to Scholars Mate. I'm your host, Sonia Debrazzini. Americans are treated to a steady diet of stories about free speech on college campuses, frequent anecdotes about speakers being disinvited, shouted down, or prevented from speaking, along with stories of students and professors having their speech suppressed, have created the impression that colleges are no longer hospitable to the free exchange of ideas. But is this situation being overblown? Is the threat to free speech on campus overstated? Joining us to discuss the issue is Joe Cohn, Legislative and Policy Director at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, a former staff attorney for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, and law clerk in the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas. He has served as a staff attorney at the AIDS Law Project of Pennsylvania and as the interim legal director for ACLU affiliates in Nevada and Utah. And joining us via Skype is Andrew Hartman, professor of history at Illinois State University. He is the author of Education and the Cold War, The Battle for the American School, A War for the Soul of America, A History of the Culture Wars, and the forthcoming Karl Marx in America. He was the founding president of the Society for U.S. Intellectual History, and he is a two-time Fulbright awardee. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. So, Dr. Hartman, is the threat to free speech on campus overstated?
Sonia, I believe that yes, the threat is overstated, which is not to say that we should not be vigilant about threats to free speech, especially on college campuses. I truly believe that the university is a place where that is perhaps more important than any other place in American life for the free exchange of ideas. And so if there are threats, when threats arise, we should pay close attention to them. We should recognize when there are threats. But we also, I think, have to take into consideration a larger context. And when I argue that the threat is overrated or overstated, I'm not just saying that it's not a concern, but more importantly, I'm arguing that there are consequences, perhaps unintended by the people who are raising the alarm bells, sometimes perhaps not unintended or intended. And these consequences have effects that are more dire than the threat to free speech itself, and that is that if there's this generalized concern across American public culture that speech is threatened on campus, that lends credibility to legislators who wish to cut public funds to higher education. And so the very purpose, the very premise of the university, I believe, is threatened by the overstated hype about threat to free speech. And so I believe that's a much graver issue. It's an issue that actually is much more real. College students in general, the generation currently in college, is more hospitable to free speech than any other generation right now in America. More than that, most college students, when asked, when polled, argue that they welcome a diverse array of perspectives in their classrooms on college and on campuses more generally. It's something that they value about their higher education experience. And most college students are generally opposed to the few high-profile cases of speakers, typically conservative speakers, being shouted down.
All right, thank you, Andrew. Now, Joe, your organization, Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE, You have a specific niche in coordination here with today's topic, and that's why you're here. Please explain us your organization's platform and also your response to Andrew's remarks.
It'd be my pleasure, Sonia. FIRE is a national, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to defending the rights of students and faculty on college campuses. Our main issues are campus free speech and campus due process. We were founded in 1999 with the specific goal of making sure that these rights were protected for people across the entire political spectrum, and that holds true today. Our board and our staff are very divided along the political spectrum to make sure that that's reflected in our work. Going to the question that you raised with respect to the scope of the problem with free speech on campus, I think that there are a lot of things that Andrew said that I agree with, but there are some things that I don't agree with fully either. A lot of people are talking about campus free speech, and certainly when a lot of people are talking about anything, some people will overstate or exaggerate particular problems or downplay particular problems in a way that's unhelpful. At FIRE, we've been around for 20 years because the problem of free speech on campus has been a long-term and pervasive problem. I think that Andrew and I probably disagree a bit on how pervasive the problem is today, but I agree with him certainly that hyperbolic descriptions that portray it as a unique circumstance now are unfortunate and wrong. We've had these problems for a long time with respect to policies on campus, speech codes that regulate what students can say and when they can. We've had problems with faculty members being disciplined for their speech when it didn't fall in line with public relations goals of institutions, and that's been true of faculty members on both sides of any controversial issue, depending on what university they're teaching at. So these problems are real and go beyond just the disinvitations of speakers or students answering surveys about whether or not they want to hear alternate points of view. When push comes to shove, the question in my mind is, are students more open to hearing views on topics that they find particularly uncomfortable?
Gentlemen, I have a question. So universities typically have libraries, dormitories, and many of them share other similarities. However, some of them now have zones called free speech zones. What exactly are they, and why would students want to utilize these zones? Andrew?
Well, this is something that I think dates back to 1960s when administrators, in attempts to contain protests, especially against the Vietnam War, within sort of defined zones on campus in which students could protest, free speech zones, which sounds a bit Orwellian, and was based upon constitutional law that made this possible. And I think we've seen this expanded since then, not necessarily on college campuses, but elsewhere. So when protesters are protesting the Republican National Convention, their free speech sort of is only allowed for very particular sort of penned up areas of the city streets. So to me, it's a bit troubling, but I don't see it as commonly used on a lot of universities that I'm aware of. And in general, like, this is where I agree with my colleague Joe, and that is that administrators are, if anyone's the problem, it's the administrators. They're always going to look for ways to avoid problems, and like bad media attention is a major problem. Professors speak their minds in controversial ways are problems, and then students who protest can't be a problem. So if they can set up zones on campus where students are allowed to protest and then are not allowed to protest elsewhere, they'll do so. But I guess I haven't noticed it as a serious problem, not on my campus or the other campuses that I'm familiar with.
Sonia, Illinois State doesn't have free speech zones, but FIRE's latest data shows that roughly 1 in 11 schools across the country do still utilize them. That's a number that's been dropping, thankfully, but 1 in 11 is still a pretty sizable problem. If we had 1 in 11 schools that were discriminating on the basis of race, we wouldn't be saying it's an insignificant problem. We'd be concerned about it, and we are at FIRE too. Interestingly enough, the free speech zones that we've challenged in litigation over the last few years have been particularly egregious and used against students of all political stripes. We had a student at Blinn College in Texas who was told she couldn't distribute literature supporting her Second Amendment rights out of their free speech zone. We defended the rights of a vegan student animal rights activist at Cal Poly Pomona who was told he had to register to use their free speech zone weeks in advance. It was a tiny free speech zone on a campus that was 1,432 acres big, and that he had to submit his literature for review and screening from administrators before he could do that. And he was also told he had to wear a badge while he was standing in the free speech zone. Luckily, it was not a yellow Jewish star, but it was really creepy nonetheless.
To me, this just sounds like an example of the banality of stupidity of university administration in general, taking the easy way out when it comes to controversial issues. This has particularly been true in the last, I would say, 10 to 20 years as a result of the fact that they have had to raise tuition on students in order to compensate for the fact that the government, usually at the state level, does not fund higher education nearly to the degree that it once did. And so they have this attitude of catering to customers, students being the customers, but really what they're catering to is a sort of media landscape in which they don't want bad press about their university. And so that's kind of like, it's a vicious cycle because we're getting increasing numbers bad press about the university surrounding this issue of free speech, which I think is overstated, which is leading to the tendency of university administrators to make more bad decisions that might limit free speech.
If I may weigh in here real briefly, our main concern when we're talking about the shifting attitudes on campuses is about what happens when you condition people to accept censorship as being normal and routine, and in some instances even desirable. And where I'm concerned about that is when there are efforts from students to recruit administrators to clamp down on something, and that's happening with increased frequency. And it doesn't have to be all 20,000 students for that to be a problem when, as you pointed out, schools are being responsive to that for a host of reasons. The consumer attitudes, corporate structure attitudes that you're describing, as well as the strong desire to avoid bad press. But we're also seeing students describing the things that are out of bounds increasingly broader in terms of how they deal with intolerance. It's that intolerance paradox of we tolerate everything but intolerance. And that is starting to expand the number of things that administrators are under direct pressure to silence and stifle. Our main focus is going to continue to be at FIRE on the administrators because at the end of the day, the buck stops there. But we're also mindful of the fact that these students are going to graduate and they're going to be leaders in their professions. Not just in politics where they'll be able to set laws and in courts where they'll be able to interpret laws, but in all different professions as well where the respect for free speech will be determined. I do want to add one other thing though, which is that I think there's agreement from both of us that this is not a unique situation to this generation. Since the beginning of when man has been able to speak, there's been someone who wanted that person to shut up. So censorship has always been kind of part of the tension in the DNA of societies, and it's not a new threat. It's being presented now in different ways as the technological advancements and incentives on campus change.
All right, gentlemen, let's take some questions from our viewers. The first question comes from Kent Hoffman, and he asks, are some conservatives guilty of being deliberately provocative on campus?
Yes, I believe that is a major concern. I believe that conservative activists, and there are some groups that actually have specifically used this tactic to their advantage, are inviting speakers to campus like Ann Coulter or Milo Yiannopoulos and others who are particularly provocative, particularly incite a response from many, many students. And they're doing so with the hope, perhaps, I would argue, or the knowledge that these speakers will be disinvited or will cause the type of controversy that will get a lot of news coverage and will demonstrate to more and more people that there's not tolerance of free speech on campuses.
You know, I think that people of all political persuasions often try to be provocative with their arguments and with their activism. So I don't think that that's unique to the right. And certainly the Constitution protects that sort of behavior. I think it's really important for individuals to make their own judgments about who warrants being listened to and whose arguments shouldn't be taken seriously. But the Constitution doesn't permit the institutions, at least public institutions as government actors, from making those distinctions.
Okay, next question comes from Crystal Fernandez. She asks, is the ulterior motives of campus censors to make conservative opinions taboo? Andrew?
No, I think the people on campus, if we're talking about administrators, their motive is they don't want controversy, they don't want any bad press for the university. And they want these problems to go away, and they perhaps wrongly have decided that the best way to make these problems go away is to create rules or regulations that would prevent controversy in the future. Some of the students might have the goal of not allowing these ideas on campus or not wanting them to be a part of the larger university culture. But going back to the full data that I cited earlier in our conversation, I think that represents a very small minority of students.
You know, I agree with a lot of what Andrew just said in terms of what motivates a lot of administrators, but I don't want to paint with too broad a brush because I think that campus administrators are diverse too, and sometimes, you know, I think this reigns true historically. People tend to censor who they disagree with. So when you want to see who's going to be censored, you look at who's in charge. And a lot of leadership of universities in 2018 happened to come more often from the left. So when politics is the grounds for censorship, conservatives are targeted more often. But I think that Andrew is right, that more of the cases about campus censorship are not about anyone's politics at all and are about the public relations aspects that he was describing.
All right, gentlemen, thank you. Now let's move on to where you each get to ask the other a question. Joe, why don't you go first?
Well, Andrew, you kind of stole a little bit of my thunder when I was going to ask you a question that you answered in your opening. I was originally planning on asking you if you agree that we should be vigilant about the instances of censorship where we do see them. But you've answered that, and thank you for agreeing that. So instead, I want to ask you if you'd be willing to work with us on revising the speech codes at Illinois State University, the written policies on the ground from administrators that restrict student speech. One in particular says that students in the dorms can't have any content about alcohol or drugs. So they couldn't advocate for marijuana legalization or advocate for it staying illegal with flyers in the dorm building. That's just one example. But my question is, would you work with us on that, I hope, shared goal?
You came prepared. I would give them a read, and I'd be happy to work with you if I disagree with any of them. It's not, this to me is one of those instances where things seem to be overstated. I've taught at this university for 13 years, and I've never even heard mention of the speech codes, which doesn't mean that they shouldn't be rewritten. So if I'd be happy to read them. And I'd be happy to work with you to revise any that I think need revision.
So, gentlemen, does it make sense that universities should possibly relook at their speech codes every so often? Or have they not been looking at the speech codes, Joe?
That's an interesting question, because anytime we write to an institution about a speech code, and I mean and an alarming percentage of the time, the response to us says, "Oh, we just started looking at that a few weeks ago." The truth of the matter is that some of these codes haven't been looked at in years and years and years and years and years, and other times they're reviewed more frequently. So we're constantly asking the general counsels at institutions to take a second look, and we're always willing to work with them on ways that they can be brought into conformity with free speech obligations and First Amendment obligations in particular at college campuses.
Andrew, it's now your turn to ask Joe a question.
Joe, I highlighted this earlier in my argument, but to what degree do you and your colleagues at FIRE consider the unintended consequences of your hypervigilance about free speech on campuses? Do you worry that creates a larger public atmosphere, that there's a crisis, which then contributes, I believe, to conservative legislators who wish to cut funds to institutions of higher education?
I do worry, and we do worry a lot at FIRE about growing hostility towards institutions of higher education coming from legislators. And that's why when we see legislative ideas that talk about threatening institutional funds, even for speech codes that we want to eliminate very badly, we repeatedly talk to legislators about being moderate and being reflective about the cost. We don't want all students to lose their Pell Grants because a school has a free speech zone. That would be senseless. But at the same time, we can't be passive about allowing constitutional violations to persist.
Okay, gentlemen, so it appears that we do agree on some things, and let's review that. Andrew, what do you agree with Joe on?
I agree that there are what I would call occasional threats to free speech on campus, and that we need an organization like FIRE to defend free speech on college campuses. I can think of some particular instances recently of faculty who have made what some might consider outrageous claims on social media, and their universities have sanctioned them. This is absurd, and I'm glad that FIRE is there to represent such professors. I would agree with FIRE's position in general that if a student group wants to invite a speaker to campus, that speaker's right to speak should be supported.
Joe?
Well, thank you for the question. There's a lot I agree with Andrew on, in particular the importance of tackling these issues in a way that isn't hyperbolic. And I think that that's something that FIRE thinks about a tremendous amount in terms of our messaging. I don't disagree that it's problematic to go after students and paint them with broad brushes either. I think that there's a long historical examples of students who have been expressing their rights on campus, and this generation is exercising their free speech rights too. But still concerned about what I see as a growing trend of students turning to censorship more often.
Thank you, gentlemen. One last question. So for the future students entering universities and also perhaps men and women who are becoming professors at universities, any advice to give to them on this topic? Joe?
Well, the first thing I would say to faculty members and students alike is that they should feel free to exercise their rights, their free speech rights and other rights on campus. And they should, I hope, be vigilant about protecting the rights of others, not just when it's people they agree with, but most importantly when it's the people with whom they disagree. It's okay to have disagreements on the merits, but still defend someone's right to engage in that marketplace of ideas. And if I were to advise anyone, it would be that that's the most important thing, being consistent and across the board about those principles.
Andrew?
The main reason that I got into this profession, the main reason I'm a history professor, is because I love the world of ideas. I love the exchange of ideas. And the world of ideas is more interesting when there's lots of different types of ideas coming from many different perspectives. So my advice to my students, and if I were to advise people who want to be history professors or professors in general, I would say just welcome the diversity of ideas. Welcome, I guess, the battle of ideas. That's what's fun about being on a university campus. And so that's something that we should value.
That's all the time we have for. We'd like to thank Joe Cohn of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, otherwise known as FIRE, and Dr. Andrew Hartman of Illinois State University for joining us to discuss this issue.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you, Andrew, for joining me today.
Yes, thanks to you both. This was a lot of fun.
And thank you for watching Scholars Mate. I'm Sonia Debrezini. We'll see you next time.